kick it off. We don't have a moment to lose here. Thank you very much for joining us after break. And I'm very pleased to launch the Pelio programs. I think Austin's our third or fourth speaker this semester. So Austin Carson is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He specializes in secrecy and intelligence and the relationship of those concepts to international relations theory, as well as international security and global governance. At the core of the research, as we're going to see from his presentation today, is an interest in understanding how governments selectively reveal and conceal what they do and the disjunction this creates between kind of front stage and what he calls backstage of international politics. His 2018 book with Princeton University Press, entitled Secret Wars, Covert Conflict in International Politics, analyzes the covert forms of military intervention and their roles in states' pursuits of limited war. I'm going to turn it over to Austin for a few minutes to contextualize his current project for us. And as usual, I'll keep the queue for comments. And if you could just briefly introduce yourself so that Austin knows who he's talking to when you ask your questions, that would be super useful.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to you for the invitation, and to Allison for making all the arrangements and the logistics. It's my first time here in Bloomington, so weather notwithstanding, I'm really glad to be here and escape the blizzard that hit Chicago right after I left. This is from a new book project, as you could tell from the sort of cover letter that I sent, which combines my interest in this information revelation and withholding stuff with my co-author, Allison Carnegie from Columbia, whose expertise is in international organizations. And what I circulated was a new draft of the theory chapter. We have drafts of 4 empirical chapters, and then sort of the bookending chapters as well. And this was sort of a reboot of us trying to distill our sort of basic claims that we're going to be returning to throughout the book in a single sort of consumable chapter. So the book's basic question is, when do states face this thing that we call a disclosure dilemma, and what do they do about it when they face it? The disclosure dilemma is a combination of any situation where states have this information about the compliance of another actor, and they have both incentives to circulate that information, which we call incrimination benefits, and they have downsides to the wide circulation of that information, public release of that information, which we refer to with this general term called adaptation costs. And the question of what do they do when they confront this sort of push and pull is, well, it depends on the institutional environment. If there's an international organization that's specially equipped to receive this kind of information, then they will disclose it to those organizations, and that kicks off a series of primarily what we frame as benefits. If that institution is not available, then the primary response is to keep that information private. The effect or sort of consequence of all of that is, if you do have that institution available and that information can enter the process of global governance, it can fill important information gaps. You can, for example, tip off the international organization to a secret nuclear site, or provide unique evidence of a war crime, or help illustrate the damage of a trade barrier from one country to firms in foreign countries. That in turn improves the likelihood that non-compliant actions are addressed, or at least identified, and ultimately, hopefully, the logic would be that the quality of cooperation would be better. At the same time, because not all governments have the same information, we try to tell a story about how this also has an effect on power. So it's easiest to see in our chapters that feature national intelligence, where a government like the United States can choose to disclose what it wants about what countries when an IO is equipped with this capability, and would not disclose it when they don't want to. So you get lots of attention on Iran, and you get no attention on Israel, for example. The book looks at it across a range of empirical domains. It does so rather thoroughly in 4 chapters, which I mentioned in the circulated memo, but also hints at some other domains that we don't get into in quite as much depth, but hope maybe other scholars will, or at least the reader will agree that this is a dynamic which is interesting to a wide audience. So by way of sort of wrapping up my comments, number one, I wanted to say I realize this is an interdisciplinary audience, and one that I don't normally get to present to be honest. We presented this at quite a few places, different versions, not this chapter, but it's usually to a pretty in-house IR crowd. And so I just wanted to say, first of all, we don't think this is the only situation where these kinds of disclosure dilemmas arise. So I'd be curious to hear if in your own fields of expertise, where you see parallels or echoes of this sort of argument in terms of the information release and withholding dynamics. And then also, we don't think these are the only institutions that serve this basic function. We even reference like a credit rating agency as an example in the domestic context of an institution that receives some information that isn't more widely circulated, but then uses that as input into a widely circulated and value-added assessment of the creditworthiness of a particular borrower. So other examples of their applications, how they might differ, are all things that are interesting to us as we try to make the appeal of this book broader than just IR, but of course IR comments are also welcome. And then, things that we are interested in help with, anything, but one challenge in this book is that we're addressing both economic and security or intelligence-focused domains. So some of these concepts we've developed in one sort of section, and now we're trying to make it capacious enough and coherent enough to also include the other sets of applications we look at. So comments on whether sort of this stuff cohered, whether, for example, what power story can we tell about the economic side of the story? We have a good one for intelligence. We don't as much have a story for how equipping an IO with this capability empowers some groups versus others in the context of world trade or investment or generally with this firm information that we see in the economic context. And we're also still thinking through this second to last section on the downstream consequences. So we've told mostly a happy story about how IOs equipped with this capability do good things, but what are some of the bad things? And how do we present those in the book without making them a center of attention? Acknowledge that doing this solves some problems and creates new ones without making those new ones become their own book, which we don't want to write a second one. Yet. So the status of the book is it's been under review. All summer it was under review. We've got a bunch of reviews. We're finalizing which publisher we're going to go with. So we still have, those were just 4 chapters that were under review, so we have the rest of the manuscript to finish, comments to address in doing so, and so now is a great time to give feedback. So thanks in advance for everything.
Thanks. Who wants to kick us off?
I think, well, one, I think it was very insightful, the sort of notion of a middleman being the holder of the secret, so to speak. I think you could strengthen up the theory by, you have a brief section as to why the organization isn't the one to collect the information.
Yeah.
And I think that could be strengthened, sort of a Hayekian notion that a lot of knowledge is very local.
Okay.
And if we think about the dispute between Canada and Brazil over airlines, they both each knew way more about their planes and so on and so forth, and what was fair and unfair than would any organization. So it makes sense, and the same would be true of intelligence.
Sure.
That the U.S. would pay particular attention, perhaps to Iran and not to Israel, as you mentioned. So I think that part could be stronger, because it's of how you would then best develop an organization to suit those needs. So you'd want to have. It's like searching for minerals.
Right.
Individuals are better at that than large firms, because they'll take risks and so on and so forth.
Right, okay.
Then another thing I was thinking of, which you hint at, I think there's some de facto organizations where secrecy is very important. And it's too bad Scott Shackelford's not here, because he's our director of Internet and Cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
So cybersecurity. Yeah. So nations around the world cooperate. And what's secret and what they share and how that is disseminated, it's a club, more or less, the way I understand it. And I think you could make the same argument for heads of central banks, which you mentioned, that I think there, instead of the rules and the institutions that bind people together, it's more norms. Almost all central bankers have had the same training. they're on the same page. When a crisis hits, they share information and secrets, and sometimes they reveal that, and sometimes they don't. So that wouldn't be the heart and soul of what you're doing, but I think it broadens the appeal as to why some things you want to keep secret and when you disclose them, because it's a similar thing about adjustment costs, which I think is really important.
Great. Should I be responding?
You can respond, or you can take more comments, however you want to do it.
Let me just respond real quick to the first one, which is just a presentational question. So, this idea of why don't we have these organizations do it themselves, I really like the suggestion to emphasize the kind of knowledge and how difficult and costly it would be for them to have sort of eyes and ears everywhere in a way that would allow them to do this. My question is simply, and just to remind you where we talk about this, we leave this to the end of the chapter. Yeah. And so one question I have is which you can speak to and others, is this like sort of a lingering issue that we need to clean up earlier? Because you hear, okay, they have this, states have this problem, they know about some things, and they don't know what to do with it. Do they share it or make it public or not? And then we talk about this IOs having secrecy and getting it donated to them. Well, why can't the IOs just go gather it themselves? Mm. We kind of left that as a section called 3 remaining questions, aka cleanup time. But do you think that's something to address earlier? Do you think maybe take it off the table at the beginning of the chapter?
I'd bring it forward, because then, I was thinking about it as I was reading. Yeah. And so if a reader's thinking about it while they're reading, take it off my mind, say, the actors, the states, or the firms, and sometimes you most times you talk about states, but a lot of times it'll be firms in these trade wars.
Totally. Okay, great, thank you.
Sarah?
Great, well, Austin, I'm going to be the other political scientist and IR person here. So I wanted to pick up on something that Lee mentioned, because he started to talk about clubs and so forth, and that gets into a question that I had sort of in the back of my mind a lot when I was reading this chapter, which is as the IR person there, I was searching for, okay, where's the variation going to be? Mm-hmm. And the variation seems to be, does an IO have an ability to keep information secret or not? And that's kind of it. And I was thinking about at one point you also have a subsection that says, is this a functionalist story? And you don't want to tell a functionalist story. And so I would like more about variation in the organizations that lead them to be able to provide more secrecy or not, and maybe that's something that comes out more in your empirical chapters. But I know very little about intelligence gathering. Sure. I'm on the IPE side, and I have a lot to talk about on firms. But I'm gonna give up the floor after this point, and maybe we'll circle back to it. But I just kept thinking on the security side about what's that club that's the intelligence organizations that are like something like something I.
Five Eyes.
Right. And so I was thinking, okay, so is this a story about how organizations that get too big become less able to keep information secret, and so there's a trade-off about clubs versus very large multilateral organizations? Where is this variation in the ability to keep information secret coming from? And I think that also, even if you don't fully develop that in your empirics, it would be useful to develop that kind of theoretically, because this also relates to sort of scope conditions. And you do have a section on scope conditions, but that it's really just about powerful IOs, right, as opposed to, and you talk a little bit about how there might be some trade-offs, but I think that could be much more kind of fleshed out in that section. Because if you're going to put aside the variation that occurs from when is it actually beneficial to share information versus when do you have, you can put that aside really, because you're really only looking at situations where there are disclosure dilemmas, right? So I want to see more kind of variation in the theory, and I think that is a good place to start.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think this is another one of these things that we're wrestling with, which is how much depth to go into. In the empirical chapters, the variation that we focus on is variation in the extent of disclosure or not. So it's actually sort of focused on the state and its intelligence, or the state and its information it has from firms, and whether they're sharing lots of it or they're keeping it private. And then we're looking at our sort of second main hypothesis, which is, given that, how well does the IO do its job? Does it resolve a trade dispute well, or is it largely guesswork because they don't know what's exactly going on at the firm level? So that's how it works, and in the paper forms, those are sort of our hypotheses and where we kind of try to attract the reader's attention to explaining variation. But you're right, that the independent variable for explaining whether there's a lot of disclosure or not is, does the institution have an effective confidentiality system or not? And so that we're treating that as exogenously given in theory, but in the empirical, we do have an empirical story in some of the applied case studies. So the trick for us is, do we want, and this is a debate we had about a year ago probably, when we were tempted to add explaining the presence or absence of that effective secrecy capability as our sort of intervening variable, and then providing some prior IV that explains that, which could be scope of membership, it could be history or not history of using secrecy, it could be organizational culture. Is it a bunch of central bankers, or is it a bunch of environmentalists or technocrats, science technocrats? And we decided we didn't want to make it a full-blown DV that we want, a dependent variable that we want to explain. So what we have now is a section, when do IOs have confidentiality systems, which is a subsection in our solution section. And what we try to do there is we try to say, well, but you might be wondering, when do IOs get this capability, kind of along the lines of your question. And we try to say, hey reader, we're not trying to make this our main explanatory variable, but here's some ideas about that. That's about where we are right now, because when we present this, we commonly get this reaction, well, when do these IOs get this or not? And we have some applied answers, as I said, in the empirics, but we haven't sort of made it a full-blown part of our theoretical story. So, so ideas for how we could do that, just sort of where we talk about it, is one thing that I'd be open to and interested in. Pushback that, like, this story isn't complete unless you make this part of the story, which might be sort of your view. That's also worth hearing, because we could consider that. We could add it to the theory, even have a chapter later in the book that kind of returns that issue and fleshes it out. As it stands, I think what we want to do is talk about it, sort of things that could be relevant, but remind the reader it's not our primary focus for explaining this. And then in the conclusion chapter say, okay, we raised some of those things back in the theory chapter, and then we saw some applied stuff in the empirics. Now let's reflect on that. And future research might look at, is it organizational culture? Is it prior historical experience with secrecy? Is it something else? Scope of membership that explains this or not?
Yeah. Can I just?
Yeah, go.
So going through, since I'm at the end of a book process, I completely understand where you're coming from here, and I'm very sympathetic to it. I would say that you have to address it in the theory chapter because everyone is going to be thinking about it.
Yep.
And so I think you have to address it. And it's okay if you say, we understand all of these things matter, right? Our primary interest is not in explaining when do you get like different types of disclosure arrangements, right? But just how does the presence or absence of this influence cooperative outcomes, and then take it up more in the final chapter. But I think you need to do more in the theory chapter to head on address that.
Yep.
And the other thing is that from what I could tell, with respect to your empirical chapters, is that it seems like all of your IOs that you are looking at there are big multilateral IOs. So you can even say we know that there's probably some aspects about what's driving this have to do with the size of the organization and so forth. And so in our research design,
Yeah.
we specifically chose to only focus on large
Yeah.
IOs so that we were so that we were controlling
Good
around
idea.
that, right? So
Or
so
even
play
like
with
a-
research
yeah.
design a little bit more
Yeah,
to get
that's
you
good.
out of that.
You could even frame it as like I like this. I hadn't thought of this, but like we could say the easy case is to take like the 5 eyes equivalent of a
Yes.
5 eyes and turn it into this like middleman because you've already built a lot of trust. You've selected into this select group of 5. Well, yada, yada. So we chose big IOs as a hard test of the theory
Yeah,
because that's a least likely environment where you see this.
right, because in those organizations, there's less likely to be high degrees of trust
Yep.
among the people who are agents for each country.
That's great. Thank you.
Stop.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out some papers in game theory.
Yeah.
So in game theory, there's this literature on mediation, and they have a similar question that there are two, let's say, agents. They are interacting, principal agent, let's say, and they have private information that they do not want to reveal because if they reveal their type is revealed, then it has consequences for them.
Right.
So it's kind of similar
Yep.
to like you want to keep information secret, but also this information is very useful for the relationship.
Yep.
And the design of mediation is basically if you can have someone who can get all this information in private and generate some rule for cooperation without disclosing the information, that would be optimal. So there are many papers on that topic
Great.
in game theory, and I can give you a list of those papers if you are
I'd
interested.
love it. Yeah, we've had a comment about that, like the IR mediation literature. We've gotten a comment on. What's like a common example or sort of like ideal situation that these papers would like in the economic realm? Who's the mediator and who are what are some examples of it?
So these are very like stylized models.
Yeah.
They just say you can apply to anything, but
Sure.
they're like Johannes Corner does have a paper on international cooperation.
Okay.
So basically the idea is that if the contracts are not enforceable.
Mm-hmm.
So if you know the type of the other party, you are going to change your behavior.
Right.
So basically the mediator has no enforcement power either.
Yep.
So the only thing is that they are going to process information in a way that creates a framework for cooperation
Yep.
without revealing the types.
Yep.
So and as I said, I mean they don't have a particular setting that this applies to. This
Okay.
could be this is very general, but
Sure.
there are papers
Cool.
that are on
All right. I will follow
international
up.
cooperation. Another, so I also have a working paper that is somehow related. It's not a mediation paper, but there is private information that parties have, and that information is useful for cooperation. But the problem is that if you reveal your information, your power to enforce the contract is going to be reduced.
Oh, interesting.
Because if you create uncertainty about what you know, then you create uncertainty about your course of action in the future.
Uh-huh.
So, and if you are dealing with different types of players, and so another important issue here is with the quality of your information.
Yeah.
So if you have some signal, let's say, of the type of the other party, but it's not perfect, so you are not, if you release that information, then you are not going to be able to punish different type of parties with
Yeah.
different probabilities. So
Yeah.
basically, if you keep uncertainty about what you know, you make the weak party more vulnerable to punishment.
Okay.
So that's why they are going to take a different type of actions. But if your information is public, everyone is treated equally basically after that.
Okay.
So yeah, so there are a lot of papers like this.
Right.
So keeping information secret is useful. Morris and Shin is another very famous paper in economics. That if you have some information, if you keep it private for like financial markets, if information about different the quality of different firms or the quality of or the situation in the the financial structure of a firm, for example, if it is completely public, then it's going to lead to a worse outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is called anti-transparency result that happens a lot in financial markets.
Okay.
That transparency is not necessarily a good thing.
Right.
Um,
Great. Cool. Well, I will follow up for some citations. That'd be really helpful. Thank you.
All right, I'm the next in the queue, so I'm jumping in. You mentioned this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you your thoughts on multiple iterations, right? So following on to Sarah's comment about the size of the I/O, but these are all large organizations that the states are interacting with in different venues over time, multiple times. So they, UN, right? But even with the ICTY, right? States are interacting over multiple cases over multiple times. And I wanted to know how you were thinking about playing the game again. Or if it even matters.
Yeah. So I haven't thought about this that carefully until now, but my first reaction is that my guess is that if it was a single iteration, you're more likely to create some kind of ad hoc solution to this disclosure problem. And whereas when you keep seeing it cropping up over and over again, and you have the expectation of participating or being implicated in those future manifestations of the problem, you're likely to pursue a more organizational or institutional solution to it. So in that sense, maybe it's less surprising to see it in the big IOs or in the multi-case tribunals, precisely because, or to see these systems emerge in them, precisely because that's the kind of situation where it's worth making the investment of institutional resources, because this stuff is not that easy to build into IOs. And it's also risky to do so, because there's always a chance you equip an IO with this capability and it gets used in a way that you didn't anticipate, you being an individual member state, deciding whether or not to support equipping the organization with this. So I think that's one way of slicing it. The other way of slicing it would be, does iteration sort of affect the beginning of the story, where is there a disclosure dilemma or not? And so there, I'll just work with the intelligence example because I can think of it. Our argument there is that the reason that public disclosure of the raw intelligence that might, say, implicate a leader in a war crime is bad is because of some future event. It's like you want to monitor that leader, or usually it's some other leader, using the same techniques, and you compromise that by going public with the information. So in that sense, we've built in iteration in the what we mean by adaptation costs, versus what you can think of, I think maybe more along Mustafa's applications or examples, where there's like sort of real time, within a single iteration, downsides to releasing that information. Or at least that's one way of sort of thinking about at least some differences in public disclosure of having negative consequences for the disclosee now versus in some future iteration. But I'm making stuff up on the fly, so I think it's interesting to think through both sides of that, I would say.
Okay. Dean.
Yeah, I wonder if you could give us a little feel for what the empirical work is
Sure.
going to be like. It's hard for me to figure out or what an observation is in the study. Is an event or a set of events?
Right.
Yeah.
So let's see. I'll take the one intelligence chapter and one econ chapter. So in the intelligence chapter, that's about nuclear non-proliferation. What we look at empirically is we focus on the United States, and each observation is a country that the U.S. is monitoring with its intelligence that is pursuing a clandestine nuclear program. And the observed outcome is where the United States shares information about that, that it has about that country. And then the second observation is, does information that is shared affect the ability of the IO to go investigate and document and scrutinize that activity? So that's equivalent to sort of cooperation, DV, and the first one is equivalent to disclose or not disclose intelligence or unique sensitive information. So what we did is we collected our own data on for the first question, on the degree to which the U.S. withheld the intelligence it had about foreign nuclear programs versus disclosed it. before and after the IO created this confidentiality system. So we take advantage of this juncture over time in which the International Atomic Energy Agency started to accept the information, and then we show that basically a lot more disclosure happened by the United States after that reform. And then we also show that very little intelligence informed the monitoring activities of the IO before, and that it played a decisive role or an important role in finding specific sites that ended up being a big part of diplomacy about Iran, Iraq, North Korea type countries after the reform. In the WTO case, the WTO chapter, we look at each individual dispute as the unit of analysis. And again, we look at change over time, where the World Trade Organization created a system for handling business-sensitive information. And we use, for example, the number of redacted words or sections of the public reports that the WTO produces as a measure for how much sensitive information was disclosed. So basically, reports before the reforms tended not to have very many redactions because that information wasn't being shared in the first place. Reports after the reforms sometimes have several thousand redactions, sort of blacked out or X'd out little sections. It just might be one word in a sentence. But those are indicative of firm level information being shared after these reforms. So that is the primary way we test that. Does that provide a bit more context? Cool, sure.
Angie?
I think, well, I think I probably need to read the whole book, in fairness. So, can you
You'd
talk,
like
huh? Yeah, no, I would really like that. So, I sort of want to follow up on several questions, because instinctively, I think when I read a theory chapter, I understand that that's sort of setting the groundwork for moving on. So, to me, I mean, sort of, I think it's sentence 3 or 4. You say, and states with unique insights about compliance have 2 basic options: disclose it or keep it private. And I respect that simplicity, which this chapter goes on to suggest maybe it's not quite that simple,
Right.
first of all. So that is, sentence number 2 bothered me, just so you know. But with that said, because the rest of the chapter clearly rejects that simplistic
Yes, it's that
division.
binary, there's a third option.
Yeah, well, a couple. I mean, to me, one of the things, and maybe I've not picked it up well enough because this isn't 100% in my wheelhouse, isn't there a very significant distinction between disclose it to a trusted authority who actually has some enforcement authority, or disclose it to the shitty-ass WTO group that can't do diddly squat. And to me, one of the incentives to not disclose it is we're not going to disclose it because that nuclear proliferation ain't going to be there tomorrow. And because so that enforcement mechanism that stands behind this decision, I'm not convinced is in here enough. But I'm straight up telling you, this was hard for me to read because it's outside my wheelhouse in many ways. But to me, because I do stuff at the UN, I'm telling you, it's always about enforcement. And if my choice is to disclose it, we'll be the world's greatest champions because we disclosed it. But I know that the mechanism in place to enforce compliance is rubbish, whether or not it exists or not. And I would like to see it actually be effectively enforced. Then doesn't that shift my decision between disclosing it and keeping it private? And so that's why, I focus on that first sentence, because I don't mean to just pick on it. I don't think there's not only do I not think it's just disclose it or keep it private, I think there's a whole different level of complexity that comes with this. To disclose it to whom? Or to what? And why? And I'm wondering if that is here and belongs in the theory section, or if it's something you don't even want to look at, or if it's later and it's part of something else that... So you've mentioned it a couple times in here, actually. So there's a really good example of the Enigma machine in different technology that was discovered. And they didn't, and you've mentioned something similar in the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, where non-disclosure was strategic because disclosure of the existence of this would have thwarted our intelligence. And it allowed us to literally, for example, in your nuclear proliferation, we just bombed the hell out of it a little bit later, and there's our enforcement mechanism. So to me, that enforcement mechanism really impacts whether or not I disclose it or not.
I see.
And I see pieces of it in here, and so maybe it's in here and I've missed it, because at times I went to some of the game theory and so I do mediation and arbitration as well. So right away I was like, oh no, there's lots of literature on this actually, of strategies to be deployed in mediation environments.
Okay.
Versus arbitration, where you got to put everything on the table. It's an interesting. So, and to me, it's all about the reason people don't use mediation quite as much is because it's about enforcement.
Okay.
You know, so I don't know. Is it later? Is it something you don't want to think about? Or have I missed it in here because you're using a different
I see.
language than I'm accustomed to?
Yeah. No, I think. I think I see you talking about two things, which is like, is the IO? Do you have an IO? What is the degree of enforcement power that an IO has?
Right.
Is it very minimal to non-existent, or does it actually have the capability to do something about the decisions it makes? And then a related, but I think a distinct issue, which you sort of illustrated with the military force option, which is, do you have other options than going through an IO and doing this information thing to address the problem that you're wanting to address?
Which is oftentimes, unfortunately, much quicker, much more reactionary, and drags in a whole different conversation to this entire chapter, quite frankly.
Right.
But they're not mutually exclusive.
No, they're not.
So in other words, you might reveal the information and then go bomb the hell out of them.
Right.
So that, I'm the big guy in the block, I can
Right.
do this, and same with trade.
Right.
You can disclose it to give yourself legitimacy for your subsequent
action.
economic or military actions. So I
Yeah,
think the enforcement is a huge one, and who's the enforcer? So small countries can't enforce. Big countries can. And so there's an asymmetric need for the international organization to enforce for smaller countries versus bigger countries. But for bigger countries, they want the legitimacy
Right.
to justify their what would otherwise be seen as unilateral actions.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't change the central conceit as we understand it in the literature on international organizations, NIR, which is that none of them have enforcement powers. So we're interested in a world of anarchy where states ultimately can give the finger to an IO anytime they want. And since Cohen 84 and even earlier, what IR scholars have been doing, I think in large part, is trying to figure out how those institutions still improve cooperation even when they lack enforcement powers. Whether you're talking about the UN, the WTO, IAEA, none of them can do forcibly impose a solution according to their preferences or their judgment. So what you have here is a scope condition, basically, or a factor which we don't think varies in institutions. But I think you're right, is something that if it were to be present, right, if the WTO could go force a country to remove its trade barriers if it judged them to be unfair, then all the more reason to share information, because that becomes a policy tool that's more effective, if that makes sense. But I think empirically it just doesn't appear that often. And that's why I think your military force comment is one that we want to think about slightly differently, because that does exist in the world, right? Just like doing it yourself,
Right.
Institutionally blessed or not. And so I think what I take that comment to be is that we need to be more explicit that we are talking about situations in which the external options, other than pursuing it through an institution, are relatively unattractive, right? So it's quicker and faster to bomb a nuclear facility or to, I don't know, send your military force in to make a firm stop being unfair or something in a trade context. But there's a lot of downsides too, and you don't want a war in North Korea, you don't want a war in Iran. There's a lot of reasons why that option is largely off the table. So then your options are, unilaterally sanction them, work through an IO to try to pressure them. And so we're really sort of talking about that, I think, relatively common situation where external options have their own problems, and governments are interested in the sort of institutionally enabled solutions, even though they don't have enforcement powers. Okay, so I think I take your point that like alternatives are important to discuss and maybe take them off the table in terms of the theory.
Yeah.
And then if there were variation in enforcement in IOs, we would want to talk about how or note that that would only sharpen the value of giving those IOs unique information that they could then act on. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, I think that's right.
Barbara?
Yes, I have several comments that dovetail, I believe, with some of the others. And in particularly, with saying, for example, the role of time.
Yeah.
As you had indicated, you expect, or you're proposing a form of organization that would not be ad hoc, just once in a while, but something that's going to be used over time. But it's not clear to me that your theory or analysis addresses the sustainability issues of having such an organization over time. Others have indicated insights related to that, but I want to offer some additional ones. If you look at things from an organization behavior or theory perspective, you get into issues of, well, first of all, how does the institution acquire the trust in the first place? But even assuming that that's the case, many organizations, particularly in many areas, are subject to what's often called a capture theory. What's going to prevent the organization from being captured over time? Okay, as people start understanding how it works and therefore be able to manipulate it. How about the fact that, okay, maybe you're starting to induce some or incent some disclosure of some secrets, but then getting into probably an aspect of game theory as well as, well, to what degree might this organization you propose actually encourage selective disclosure of secrets as a form of manipulation? I see this all the time in the industry where I came from, which was telecommunications, that interfacing with government, the companies selectively decide which things they want to disclose or not because they have a bigger game in play. And depending with multiple players. And so they're perceiving that, well, I might selectively disclose in this case because maybe strategically this is in my favor, but then I'm going to hold back other ones and nobody's going to know because by definition it's secret.
Right.
Okay.
What's the context, by the way, that you're talking about? Like, what are they disclosing to the government about what?
Now this has to do with information about their costs.
Sure. Why does the government need to know that?
Well, it depends on the regulatory setting.
Sure.
But whenever you have an organization that might have jurisdiction, if you will, in some vein or another, they're subject to manipulation about how the jurisdiction is played with.
Sure.
And if you're going to have an organization who has the jurisdiction, if you will, to receive certain kinds of information, that's always potentially gained.
Sure.
Because the organization or state in question always has multiple interests to play.
Totally.
And it's like even in legal settings or lawmaking, you whipsaw one issue against another.
Sure.
So you can have selective disclosure of secrets over time. And then how do you deal with the fact that this proposed organization, what's the nature of its interrelationship with other international organizations or related domestic ones? Because now you're going to have to start building interfaces between whatever this organization is and the other ones that exist. And how can that be gained? And particularly if, as Angie mentioned, the organization proposing has no enforcement powers, well, then what's the relationship of this organization going to be with the ones that do or might? Those can be gained as well. So I don't see, so far theory-wise, how this organization proposing, how you're capturing its sustainability over time when you have it interacting with other organizations or other entities that have changing incentives over time.
Sure.
And over time is what matters. If it's not going to be a one-off.
Yeah.
And so I don't see the theory actually addressing that. So the role of time with other organizations and with the entities who have, or as an economist would say, they have a very complex production function or utility function or whatever. You know, there's lots of different issues. And there's lots of different ways you can game and play one against the other.
Sure.
And so that's why, you know, there's different insights from different fields. And then lastly, I think this was covered more early in the discussion, this distinction between the incentive, creating incentive to disclose certain facts that they wouldn't otherwise, versus the ability to have any kind of power, investigatory power, to determine facts. Because here's the thing too, even when you're going to disclose a quote-unquote secret, the secret can be spun. And the nature, what aspect of the secret or what aspect of the facts you disclose can be manipulated. And so if the organization to which you're disclosing it has no power to ask any questions to better, fuller flesh out the context in which the secret's being disclosed, that's just another form of manipulation that's permitted. So, and then the last point related to that is that you try and set up the scope of things that your book is going to address, which are these disclosure dilemmas. But what's interesting is what happens when certain kinds of facts are secret. How do I say this? Maybe I could do it more by showing the counter. One interesting thing that became apparent, let's take the United States. In the United States, we have a National Traffic Safety Board, TSB, okay, whose mission is fact-finding. But it has no policy-making power. The FAA does. But because they separated those two, the policy-making apparatus, being separate from NTSB, creates less of a problem to end up manipulating the fact-finding endeavor. Now, what triggers the NTSB getting involved is often a crisis or some kind of accident. So the other thing that I'm wondering here is, what is the distinction between secrets that may arise because there's no crisis event or triggering event or focusing event, so it's really more hidden, versus secrets that might be attached to events that arise from a crisis or focusing event? And to me, that's another element of the topology you might consider, because there's different kinds of secrets, or as to what portion is secret. The NTSB was set up, at least if there's a triggering event, it has the ability to go in and fact find. But absent a triggering event, unless you have investigatory power that you can initiate, you don't go anywhere. So it wasn't also clear to me the scope of the secrets that you're talking about here. Are you talking about the kind of secrets you're trying to do disclosure for, where there's just no other freaking way of having a clue that it's there? Or are you also meant to include even secrets that are attached to things for which there might be focusing events, but so far there's no robust organization to deal with it? Sorry to be a little long-winded, but I thought maybe the distinction would help. So it's more how, so the time thing is really important about sustainability and all the different ways in which the sustainability of an org also could be problematic. So thanks for bearing with me while I went through that.
So just real quick, Angie, you had a two-finger, and then Sarah, you wanted to jump in again on firms. Does anybody else have any comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, I was going to not respond for the rest of the time, just to make sure, even if you're not on the list, if some folks want to just use the extra time to comment or get on the list, because you've heard enough from me.
Angie, you had a two-finger?
I had just one comment that must have been something that Barb said that triggered, and again, individuals regardless of organization. I'm always intrigued when they shift. So we were just in a big negotiations and I walked into the room and everything changed when we all realized we had all been with other NGOs. Last time we had a similar conversation in a different large international organization. So, you know, I just wonder if that's something that needs to be factored into the conversation, is the idea that information is more likely to be shared, especially sensitive and private information, amongst people who have a prior trustworthy relationship, regardless of the organization that we're affiliated with. It's just a thought.
Sarah, do you want to?
I'm going to talk to you about firms at lunch, but I wanted to sort of bring us back, I think, and do a little bit of translating, because I feel like you're getting a lot of like really good comments about how you need to like, or how nuance needs to be added in. But I also want to bring it up to kind of the broad theoretical contribution, which as I see it, is really important in the IR literature. And you haven't written the conclusion of at least this chapter yet, and you discussed that you are interested in bringing in kind of thinking about the ways in which information disclosure or non-disclosure is related to other types of power in the international system. And so, you know, starting from a very kind of, I mean, Furon looms large in IR generally, right? And so if you like just start from Furon, right? And then one of the big things that prevents efficient cooperation, or at least setting a deal, or whatever, right, is incomplete information. From a transaction cost economics perspective, institutions are there to help reveal information so that we all know where everyone stands, so therefore we can reach some sort of settlement, and we don't need to have costly wars or trade wars or things like that to get to that settlement. We can just air our dirty laundry and get it all out on the table, right? And so what you're showing is that there are limits to that, right? Or at least that, and this is where I'm not entirely sure where you want to go with this, and I really encourage you to articulate kind of what the bottom line is for you and Allison, because I think this is where your contribution really is made, right? Is it that there are limits to transparency, that at a certain point we need to protect some amount of privacy or non-transparency in order to get to cooperative solutions, right? And that institutions that are too transparent are going to be problematic, right? Or is it that institutions that allow for this sort of non-disclosure are actually perpetuating problematic power differentials in the international community, because they're allowing the most powerful countries to retain their ability to decide when to disclose or not. And I think that this is a really interesting question, something that I think makes a really important contribution. I have been on a tear recently about how much I think that our current world shows us that Northian conceptions of institutions are really problematic, and that institutions are tools, right? I see this as being related to that sort of critique. I'm not sure if that's where you want to go, but I want to know sort of what is the bottom line for you and Allison here. How does knowing the sort of the limits of transparency in institutions for generating outcomes, what does that tell us about institutions and about the role of institutions in international relations?
Wait, I want to just two-finger to understand your tear. So institutions are strategic tools, not value-neutral rule setting. What is the tear? That institutions are tools, they're not rules of the game. That institutions are manipulated by the actors that
oh my God, is that true?
But this is my book. You should read my theory chapter. Great, good.
So I think this is really, I think, let's not lose sight of like kind of the big thing that you have here, because I think the big thing is really important.
Well, fantastic closing comments. Austin, you have 2 minutes just to wrap us up in general, either by responding or offering some final feedback. Did we get everybody? Okay, great.
These are just great. I think it's hard not to respond to the specific comments. I think these last couple of comments over here and with Sarah were exactly where we're struggling, which is thinking about like what we're calling downstream consequences is what you were calling sustainability, and how observable is any capture. I think that would be, without getting into detail, the key would be how is observable is capture, because we have a section called Discretion and Selective Disclosure. So we are embracing that this, once you have an IO with this capability, you, as the state that is disclosing or not, is choosing whether to disclose based on your interests, not based on we want the world to be a happy kumbaya place. But the question whether or not that leads to capture and whether that capture has a sustainability implication is about whether or not that selectivity is observable and so problematic as to basically make the organization change what it does or make people not want to use the organization or things like that. So we're thinking through that. And then in terms of the Furon and information story, you know, I certainly think we would agree that this is a story about how too much transparency limits cooperation, and that the existing view from Furon and from Cohen is too little information limits cooperation, and institutions maximizing information maximizes cooperation. Honestly, we want to say both of what you proposed, which is that it can be both the case that more cooperation happens with less transparency, according to our book, and that that cooperation is biased in favor of certain kinds of states. So it both perpetuates or even creates new manifestations or expressions of power, and at the same time, it allows certain things to be addressed that wouldn't be addressed otherwise. And the reason I think that's true is that you have war criminals that are, you know, being convicted that wouldn't be convicted without this intelligence. So that's a story about how less transparency just led to more effective cooperation. But at the same time, that is, it's no accident that those leaders and not other leaders were the object of intelligence disclosures. And we have a whole chapter in Rwanda where we say basically one side had intel disclosed about it and one side didn't. And it was because the US liked Kagame and his forces as a future ally, and it didn't like his opponents. And so that can be true. So I think somehow we want to say both, because that's actually what I think the book says. But I think a lot of people see it as either or. Either you're saying this is a story about how institutions, through this weird non-transparency thing, can solve cooperation, and therefore you're not saying tool of power. Or you're saying tool of power and you're not saying cooperation enhancing. And I genuinely think it's both, but I don't know if we're going to be able to convince people of that. So we can talk about that more at lunch.
With that, thank you so much, Austin, for joining us.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. That's very helpful.
I have one point, and I think it was brought up by other people. I don't think you can put in the